Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 1950s and the Cold War, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Florida Virtual School and America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, and I'll be moderating the session this morning. It's good to be back online with all of my Florida friends. I hope you all are serving up some good weather for the latter part of the week, because I'll be down in Florida to do some work with the Florida Humanities Council. I'm looking forward to my visit. Let me just remind you, as always, at the end of the seminar, the recording of this program will be available on the 1950s and the Cold War website. The PowerPoint will be there as well, and we invite you, as always, to plunder the PowerPoint for your classes. There, too, of course, you will find the evaluation, and we ask you please to fill that out and submit it to us. And once we get that, as we have in the past, we'll send you documentation of participation so that you can present that to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit your participation warrants. So let's get underway promptly this morning, ladies and gentlemen. The understanding that we're aiming at in this seminar: the immediate post-war period, marked by an atmosphere of suspicion and fear, showed how the American public and its representatives opted for conformism at the expense of autonomy and for authority at the expense of liberty. So that's what we'll be aiming at in this seminar this morning, and we hope that's the takeaway you'll be able to bring back into your classes. We've got some really good questions on the forum, and we're going to try to get to all of these today. How did the fear of nuclear war affect life in America? How real was the nuclear threat? Was it propaganda reserved for Americans? Did people in the Soviet Union share the same fear? We had several questions about McCarthyism, and we'll be talking about that in detail this morning. How did Senator McCarthy come to have so much power in this country? Was McCarthyism rooted in American culture, or was it something new in the 1950s? Who were the targets of McCarthyism? Then there were some questions about other agencies in the government. What role did government institutions like the FBI play in the repression of the 1950s? Questions about private organizations. Did private organizations like corporations play a role? Now, these next three questions actually take us beyond our time frame, the 1950s, and if we have time, we'll get to them at the end of the program, but they're very good questions. Did the nature of the Cold War change in the 1960s? How serious was the Cuban Missile Crisis? What effect did it have on the Cold War? How has the fall of the Soviet Union and the release of documents from Soviet and Warsaw Pact archives changed our view of the Cold War? Have we learned anything from Chinese sources that has changed our views of the Cold War? Excellent questions. So let's get underway. We are very pleased to have with us this morning Steve Whitfield, the Max Richter Professor of American Civilization at Brandeis University. He specializes in studying the intersection of politics and ideas in 20th century America, and in 1991 he published The Culture of the Cold War. So let's turn the program over to Steve. Let me just find his name here on the board, and I will turn things over to him. Let me do that. Okay, Steve, you are now the presenter, so tell us about the 1950s and the Cold War.
Yes, first of all, I would like to welcome everybody, and with a special welcome because I was educated entirely in the public schools of Jacksonville, Florida, where I grew up. So it's a special pleasure, really, to participate in this. And the context here is clearly, as Richard's remarks first indicated, the claim that something peculiar happened in the immediate period after the Second World War. That is the sense that something had changed in terms of the undermining of the extraordinary power that the United States projected at the end of the Second World War. In August of 1945, half of the world's goods and services were due to the American economy. There had never been a nation that had dominated the world's economic stage to the degree that the United States did. The United States, even though the bomb was constructed with the aid of British scientists as well in the desert in Los Alamos, New Mexico. So the immediate antecedent of the shift from emphasizing liberty to stressing stability, authority, even conformism, really can be explained in terms of the immediate post-war period, that is the end of the 1940s, when the extraordinary, the unprecedented American power was basically undermined the loss of the nuclear monopoly, which occurs in the late summer of 1948 when the Soviets acquire an atomic bomb. The sense, in other words, the following year, October 1949, when the most populous country on the planet, China, becomes communist. All of this then leads to an extraordinary sense that whatever power the United States had managed to exert, even a kind of almost omnipotence, at the end of the Second World War, that was draining away, and that led to a climate of anxiety and fear. So that from that point on, that sense of insecurity led to recrimination. It led to an effort to find out what had gone wrong. The Democrats had been in power ever since early 1933 with the election that previous November of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Democrats, in other words, had maintained power even in 1948 when the surprising election of Harry Truman. The Republicans were very eager to regain the White House, to regain the executive branch, and therefore they had a kind of special incentive to blaming the Democrats for the loss of the sense of security. So that is the immediate antecedent, and since American power was now suddenly feeling threatened or undermined, it could easily be accounted for, some people believed, by the search for traitors from within. That is, American power had been basically unchallenged, really until the Korean War that is inaugurated in June of 1950. But the evident power of the United States abroad seemed to be, it was suggested by some, to be undermined by a sense that somehow something had gone wrong from within. And that led to the realization that there may be Americans who were responsible for that sense, in other words, that something had clearly happened to national security. And this emotional vulnerability could easily be exploited by those who were seeking personal and political aggrandizement. The sense, in other words, that this was an atmosphere that could very, very easily be exploited. The chief instruments for that exploitation were the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which had been founded in 1938 and whose primary task was to find communists. And then the unprecedented emergence of a demagogue like Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, Republican of Wisconsin, and his flair, his special gift for exploiting fear and for slandering, for mendacity. This was to have an extraordinary and remarkable impact in the emerging anti-communism that we associate with the Cold War. So that would be one way of thinking about the sources here, the genesis of the often vehement and reckless anti-communism that we associate with the 1950s. And you might say, to engage in a kind of spoiler alert here, that it really comes to an end roughly by the end of the 1950s. McCarthy dies basically of drinking in 1957. The House Committee on Un-American Activities, which had been able to run rampant without any particular judicial controls upon its effort to find communists and others, that begins to HUAC begins to be put on a bit of a leash by the end of the 1950s, the early 1960s, by the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the Chief Justice was Earl Warren. So that would be a kind of overview here of the atmosphere that is the focus really of our discussion really this morning. The first committee that is looked at here, that is a kind of institutional base of HUAC, was HUAC, and that committee had a peculiarly, I would say, ambiguous mandate. Usually, legislative committees have one primary purpose, and that is to discover the bases for legislation. Usually congressional committees, unless they're particularly investigating another branch of government like the executive branch, their task is really to gather the information that will provide the most informed judgment upon which the United States Congress, in its wisdom, can enact legislation. The tricky part, the dicey part of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, as you can see from this particular slide, is really to do something that looks uncertain in relation to the United States Constitution, especially the First Amendment, that is the first part of the Bill of Rights, which seems to guarantee all sorts of peaceful activities that could be occurring, the expression of those activities, the right really to dissent, and therefore the peculiar feature of the role of the House Committee on Un-American Activities was that its writ was something that almost certainly in all cases collided with the constitutional right of freedom of expression, freedom to peacefully assemble, to, as the First Amendment says, petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the tricky challenge that was faced by HUAC is that it could stigmatize, it could incite fear, it could intimidate, but it could not really legislate without conflicting with the United States Constitution. And that made the activities that were investigated by HUAC, it made them often very difficult to figure out, except in terms of that capacity really to inflict fear upon communists, upon people who could be accused of being communists, upon people who could resemble the sort of dissidents that might be, who might be sympathetic to communism. But it could not directly draw from such investigations, it could not draw the legislation upon which the ultimate rationale of any committee of either the House of Representatives or of the Senate could in fact be drawn upon for purposes of proposing or enacting laws. And therefore it aimed at maximizing the sense, in other words, that there might be some sort of coercive imposition upon those whom it simply wished to, in various ways, demonize. And because its task really was furthered by promoting that sense of stigma, rather than figuring out what would be the best legislation dealing with such activities, it inevitably gravitated toward Hollywood, where movie stars and possibly in certain cases movie directors, but certainly actors, actresses, and those who were involved in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, who would include script writers, directors, producers, bringing them to the attention of the public through interrogation and through subpoenas. That was the best way by which the House Committee on Un-American Activities could in fact be could promote its particular aims.
Okay, Steve, we have a question here in the chat. Why could the committee not legislate? Why would Congress create a committee that could not do what their committees normally did?
Yeah, it's a terrific question, and it relates back to the extraordinary degree of ambiguity that marked HUAC itself. That is, HUAC was a response beginning in the end of the 1930s to the radicalism that was ancillary to the New Deal itself, to the extraordinary crisis of capitalism that the Great Depression represented. And therefore, HUAC is formed in some ways to counter radicalism. Those who served on HUAC tended to be conservatives, whether they were Democrats or Republicans. But it could never solve the problem that in opposing radicalism, and especially in opposing communism, it could not, of course, violate the United States Constitution, which guarantees to everyone the right of dissent, the right to form and join political parties, the right to oppose policies of the government. That was the self-contradiction. But if you, as a congressperson, if you opposed HUAC, it looked as though you were soft on communism and were unable to discern the seriousness of the threat that communism posed.
Mm-hmm. So, Steve, let me could pose a few follow-up questions. Was there ever an attempt to define precisely what un-American meant? Yeah, that seems to be the key ambiguity right there.
Yes, Richard, that's a wonderful question as well. And I believe the answer to that was no, that there was no such effort. Mm-hmm. Un-American, certainly by the 1950s, when the external threat, that is the foreign threat posed by the Soviet Union, un-American activities, of course, could easily be seen as synonymous with communism. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the task was easier because a communist, virtually by definition, was doing something that would be contrary to American national interest, because the Communist Party was basically subservient to Moscow, to the Kremlin. But beyond that, the definition of un-American was remarkably hazy and remarkably elastic. And Richard, if I can jump ever so slightly ahead,
sure.
The focus on communism as the equivalent of un-American activities eventually put the committee in a bit of a bind, which they sought to resolve by the late 1960s in dealing with fascists, for example, with dealing with neo-Nazis, and ultimately with white supremacists associated with the Ku Klux Klan. So there came to be, outside the immediate chronological framework of our discussion this morning, there certainly came to be a wider definition. But in the period we're looking at, it was very easy simply to assume that because a communist ultimately was submissive to the dictates of the international communist movement, that was simply the equivalent of being un-American.
Right. So later on then in its history, it did begin to look at un-American activities on the right wing. But during this period, they didn't explore things like the Ku Klux Klan or anything like that. This time, it was focusing just on left-wing activities, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Right.
And let me ask you another thing. You said that they went immediately for Hollywood, and I've often wondered about that. Why Hollywood? Was it the sense that Hollywood was subtly, or maybe not so subtly, propagandizing the American people through movies, or was there a less sophisticated reason to attack Hollywood?
Yeah. I think, Richard, that the key reason was because movie stars are usually among the most famous people in America. Mm-hmm. In some ways, their faces, of course, are more familiar even than sports heroes. So in that sense, if you're seeking to ultimately promote the value of your committee by demonstrating the danger that certain people in the United States pose, Hollywood, in that sense, is a very good target. There was a subsidiary motive which your question hints at, and that is in the 1940s and before the full emergence of television, movies were the most powerful, the most popular form of American mass entertainment, more so than radio, more so than the dying phenomenon of vaudeville, more so certainly than publishing. Mm-hmm. And therefore, movies were seen to be especially insidious if communist propaganda were somehow injected in them in ways that could be misleading. And because of the sheer emotional power of movies, the sense that communism might gain an inroad there seemed to be an especially sensitive topic. Uh-huh. And there were communists, of course, in Hollywood, mostly in the form of writers, but to some extent others mostly behind the screen. And that was something that HUAC looked at, but they could never actually find much in the way of actual communist propaganda, and therefore they tended to drop that.
Right. Now, at this time, of course, we didn't have TV, and radio was still pretty new. Did they look at print media?
Generally speaking, I believe the answer to that was no.
Uh-huh.
Print media, of course, would be, again, something that would be less powerful in terms of the emotional reach. There was an occasional publisher, an occasional editor who might be called before a congressional investigating committee. Offhand, I can't think of any prominent figure in the publishing industry. Of course, in 1956, Arthur Miller was called.
Right.
One of America's most famous playwrights by then. But his subpoena came really because of the far greater fame of his fiancée, Marilyn Monroe.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I think HUAC would not have been particularly interested in a mere playwright.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question here. How does a professed communist, some of the writers, practice communism in a capitalistic society, or was it just advocacy? Good question.
Yes, very good, and it entails a complicated answer that does not permit me to do justice really to the question. At one level, there was espionage, and we're going to get later in the program, of course, to Alger Hiss. So at one level, some communists did in fact become figures in the Soviet underground, the Soviet espionage system in the United States. But generally speaking, somebody who was a communist before that network was not seen to be suitable because they could always be tracked down as having been a communist and therefore unreliable. Broadly speaking, communists were involved in the labor movement, where they promoted often great militancy. Communists were involved in the movement for racial equality and racial justice because communism believed that class, not race, not religion, was the most important way of the most important form of social category. It could be done by advocacy. It could be done by leafleting. It could be done by mobilizing protests and rallies against American policies, whether capitalistic or in foreign policy. Generally speaking, with the notable exception, the important exception of espionage, communist activities were above ground, were common, were accepted in the 1930s, broadly speaking, and in that sense looked like within the broader framework of dissent and of the right to oppose the policies of the persons of the American government, to oppose the power of corporations, to oppose the policies of the CEOs, although that term wasn't used then. So in that sense, to be a communist was indeed to do what other Americans who had political feelings and passions could do.
So in other words, this is why they couldn't legislate, right? If they tried to legislate against that activity, they run right into the First Amendment, freedom of speech.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. And so to make it clear then, did any legislation eventuate from the HUAC hearings at this period?
No legislation that could in fact be upheld by an increasingly liberal United States Supreme Court. It's a question that I frankly don't know with utter precision how to answer, but there were laws passed, particularly by the Senate, the Communist Control Act. Those laws had a fairly brief life and were increasingly chipped away at by the Supreme Court. I can't think of HUAC introducing legislation that ultimately passed constitutional muster.
Okay. And before we move on to Larry Parks here, one more question about HUAC's targets. Did they go after universities and professors?
Generally speaking, the answer to that was no, they did not. Senator Joe McCarthy had a somewhat greater interest in American academic life, especially at places like Harvard. But HUAC, with some exceptions, avoided the universities because the universities then and now were not exactly the places that most Americans had any special familiarity with who might be called and demonized and stigmatized. I hesitate to answer that definitively because there were cases. I'm thinking, for example, of Frank Oppenheimer, who taught physics at the University of Minnesota, who was the brother of the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Frank Oppenheimer was called before HUAC, was asked if he was a communist, refused to answer, and within an hour was fired by the University of Minnesota. So that was a case, maybe a kind of special case because of Frank Oppenheimer's very, very prominent and very important brother. But generally speaking, HUAC was outside the frame of attentiveness of HUAC.
Okay, well, we've got a little over an hour, so shall we move ahead?
Okay, so we'll go now to Larry Parks, because his testimony in 1951 was to become perhaps the most poignant, the most agonizing of all those who were subpoenaed before HUAC, in revealing the methods that HUAC was to employ. Larry Parks had been a communist. He was no longer a communist when he testified in 1951. He had become, if anything, a kind of anti-communist. He had a very promising career. He starred in The Jolson Story and won an Academy Award for his performance. He was a kind of rising star. But because of his prominence, he was a very tempting target in 1951. And Parks engaged in an effort to do what he felt was morally reprehensible, and that was he tried to bargain and negotiate with HUAC that although he would be expressing his own shame and his own remorse about having been a communist, he was reluctant to testify against others because that violated his conscience. And HUAC pounced on that, because for him, and let's go to the next slide here, it meant that he was not fully cooperative with HUAC. So the slide indicates now that he wanted to demonstrate that he was anti-communist. He was opposed to the role of communism, whether in Hollywood or in American academic, in American life, entertainment business, and beyond it. But he felt that there was a stigma that would be attached to him by being an informer. The word informer itself has a kind of morally pejorative implication to it. He was very fearful that his own son would not look up to him if he named names. And Parks was also aware that none of the people who he knew in the Communist Party in Los Angeles had done anything that was illegal, not done anything that was criminal, and in that sense he could only do them harm by naming their names. And the extraordinary character of his testimony is the extent to which the more he begged, the more he pleaded, the more HUAC insisted that without his naming names, his patriotism was therefore in question. The more he refused to be an informer, and the American language has all sorts of names for informer, like being a rat or a fink or a rat fink, to be a canary. All of this was something that he was well aware of and he did not want to do. And as a result of that, his testimony becomes a striking document, and if there are some examples from this testimony, of course, on the screen, is his testimony is evidence of the coercive authority that HUAC took for granted that it could exert. And the oddity here, and what makes the culture of the Cold War so strange, is that the Parks testimony proves that if you were reluctant to name names, if you were reluctant to do what most people in most circumstances don't want to do, that meant that you were still somewhat of an un-American, and that the only way you could prove your patriotism, the only way you could demonstrate that you were indeed a good citizen, was to do something that was morally and ethically offensive.
Steve, if we could go, excuse me, if we go back to that previous slide, it might be good to read that testimony, just to give people a sense of what that was like. And then we've got a good question here, and give our participants the opportunity to weigh in here. Would you like me to take it? I do a really good Larry Parks imitation. You want me to try that?
Please do it, Richard.
Okay. I am not a communist. I would like to point out that, in my opinion, there's a great difference between being a communist, say, in 1941, 10 years ago, and being a communist in 1951. To my mind, this is a great difference, and not a subtle one. It is also, I feel, not a subtle difference to be a member of the Communist Party and being a communist. I do not believe in my own mind that this is a subtle difference either. I would furnish you with, I guess you would call it an allegory, as to what I mean, so that you will see why I say it is not a subtle difference. The president of this country is the head of the Democratic Party. There are many people who call themselves Democrats. There are certain Southern Democrats, for instance, that do not follow the aims and platform of the Democratic Party, yet they are called Democrats. They, in my opinion, are Republicans, really. So then you ask, and it's a perfectly good question here, why does he insist on the great difference between 1941 and the date of his testimony in assessing the meaning of party membership? What was the difference? So let's hear from some of our participants on that. We've got some comments here. Here's a question while we're waiting for some responses. Did the people of this time just share common ideas, ideals, thoughts, or did they proclaim to be a communist? I ask because of the crossover of ideals between socialism, etc. So maybe we could explore that. What Parks is getting at that. What did it mean to be a communist in 1941? Here we have Laura Wakefield notes that clearly a difference since we were allied with the communists in World War II. Jack Harder notes the same thing. So maybe we could explore, Larry, why did people join the Communist Party, say, back in the 30s and 40s? What prompted that? Any generalizations we can offer?
Yeah. Yes, it's true that the communists, once Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in late June of 1941, the communists, in effect, gave up the alliance with Nazi Germany and demanded that Nazi Germany and its allies be defeated. That is, fascist Italy and eventually, of course, Japan. The tricky part here is that those who joined the Communist Party in 1941 often did so for a number of different motives. In 1941, it would have only made sense from a, let's call it a progressive point of view, after June 1941. Before June 1941, a communist was somebody who had to believe that the United States should not enter the Second World War on the side of England and those tiny numbers of remaining countries that were still at war with the Axis powers. Presumably, Parks joined after June 1941, when, as the question noted, it was in fact something that seemed to be an overlapping set of ideals. The Communist Party during the war even, in a sense, dismissed itself and called itself a communist political association, no longer wished to call itself a party, was extraordinarily patriotic, and communists served often with great valor and courage in the Second World War in the United States military. All of that was very much true, and of course that is one of the features that HUAC was able to engage in, because HUAC basically wanted to collapse the difference between 1941 and 1951. HUAC wanted basically to deny that there was any discontinuity between being a communist at the beginning of that decade and to be a communist at the end of that decade. So people like Larry Parks were in effect forced to insist on the historical difference, the motives, the very historical context, which HUAC sought to deny. What is tricky about HUAC, about the HUAC testimony that Parks engages in, is also the second part of that statement, because here Parks is clearly wrong, and that is to be a communist in any part of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, up to 1956 at least, meant that you didn't really have any differences with the leadership of the party. The Democrats obviously were a very, very different kind of political party. It included segregationists in the South as well as black Americans in the North. So that the Democratic Party allowed was indeed one very big tent in the 1940s and 1950s. That was certainly not true of the Communist Party, and Parks is, for whatever reason, is simply stating something in his testimony that is simply not true. Richard?
Sorry, I've got to turn my mic on here. In the
sorry.
30s, we got on our participants' note here in the 1930s. If you were communist, your issues were largely labor issues
Yes.
and economic issues.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Okay, should we go back to Larry Parks now?
Yeah, let's go back to go his additional testimony there. Why
did you want to do your Parks imitation?
Oh, well, okay, we could wrap up Larry's testimony here.
Okay.
Well, counsel, these I would prefer not to mention names if it is at all possible. I don't think it is fair to people to do this. I have come to you at your request. I will tell you everything that I know about myself because I feel I've done nothing wrong, and I will answer any question that you would like to put to me about myself. I would prefer, if you will allow me, not to mention other people's names. Well, as I asked the council and as I asked the committee, if you will allow this, I would prefer not to mention names under these circumstances, that these were people like myself who, and I feel that I have done nothing wrong ever. I mean, along this line. I am sure none of us is perfect. Again, the question of judgment certainly is there, and even that is debatable, but these are people. So let's pose to our participants the question you raised here. Why did HUAC want the names of party members that Parks might have known? And that's kind of curious. I mean, just this emphasis. I mean, it wasn't just Parks' testimony. They asked all sorts of people to name names. So maybe our participants could suggest why there was such an emphasis on names, getting the names, witch hunts, targets, right? Fishing expedition, yeah.
Yes. Yes, the number of these questions are extremely relevant here to the heart of HUAC's operation, because thanks usually to the FBI, HUAC actually already had the names of various associates, and therefore it was not a matter of actually needing information so much as it was about figuring out what is the character of the witness. To what extent can that witness be trusted to have truly renounced communism? And therefore, naming names, which is seen to be, as I mentioned, the sort of thing that most people would be morally impeded from doing. They basically wanted to make sure that somebody was shamed into naming names. And the penalty that Larry Parks paid was because, as this testimony that you beautifully reproduced, Richard, what that does is indicate that his reluctance to name names was evidence that he had really not fully cooperated. And therefore, Parks's promising career came to an end as a result of this testimony. His career in Hollywood was basically over because HUAC simply didn't like the degree to which he demonstrated that he was ashamed of having to name names.
Doesn't this also go back to HUAC's inability really to legislate? I mean, that means the primary function of the committee was publicity, and if they could, find more and more people to drag before them, the greater the publicity.
Yes, that's right. And then what the other lesson here is not only that publicity was the primary focus rather than identifying people who had committed no crimes in 10 years earlier or 5 years earlier. The other function was, as a result of the ruin of Larry Parks's career, everybody else after him had better make sure that they were very forthcoming, very cooperative, very willing to name names if called upon to name names. And this is why the Parks testimony, it strikes me as so significant in the entire arc of the career of HUAC.
Right, and we have an interesting comment here from a participant who elaborates on the logic of HUAC. By being unwilling to turn others in, that in itself is unpatriotic because those people were a danger to our society. So by not turning people in, you're aiding and abetting enemies of our society.
Yeah, the tricky part is that the so-called enemies of society, whom Parks presumably knew, were indeed law-abiding Americans who happened to be working in the entertainment industry. And That is, again, why, as you can see in the testimony that Parks provided, that is why he was so reluctant. He didn't quite understand why he had to name names of people who were operating within the protection of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Right. We have a question here. There's one of our forum questions, too. Did the recently formed CIA and NSA provide intelligence to HUAC, or was it just the FBI or any other government agencies?
Very good question. To the best of my knowledge, and here I don't claim to have any real expertise, the CIA was really not involved in investigating Americans for their domestic activities. It was the case rather a little bit later in the decade, in the 1950s, that the CIA did get involved in, for example, in drug testing. But to the best of my knowledge, the surveillance of un-American activities or potentially subversive activities was really the responsibility of the FBI, where the intelligence agencies who were monitoring dialogue and information across the in an international framework, that is international traffic. They were indeed later responsible for revealing the extent to which there was indeed greater espionage within American communists that had previously been known, the so-called Venona transcripts, although those didn't become public until the 1990s. So there was evidence there, particularly with Alger Hiss, who had gone to the Yalta Conference and also went to Moscow in February of 1945, some evidence that was then drawn upon, but it was not primarily that responsibility.
And here we have a very interesting question here. Is there any credence to these witch hunts being religiously motivated? Since so many of the people in Hollywood were Jewish, did anti-Semitism figure into this at all?
My guess would be probably not. Larry Parks himself was not Jewish. Elia Kazan was not Jewish. There were, of course, Jews who were disproportionately relevant to the Jewish population involved in Hollywood. The leading anti-Semite in Congress was John Rankin, Democrat from Mississippi, who was a blatant anti-Semite. But he was kind of freakish. He was a bit of an anomaly. He was, in fact, even a bit of an embarrassment. And I don't think that anti-Semitism was a motivation here. There was no, within HUAC, there was no particular religious motivation or aura. It was a strictly political, publicity-oriented operation.
I see. Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Yeah. Okay, now we're going to, sorry. Should we go past Larry Parks? I'm just concerned about the time.
Yeah, why don't we move on? I think unless there are any other questions about Larry Parks.
I'm happy to try to answer anything else.
Let's see if we have any questions here more about Larry Parks and the attacks on Hollywood. Nothing seems to be coming in. If anybody would like to raise a question as we go forward, please do. But let's go on. Let's move ahead.
Okay, now we come to probably the most famous of those who were called before HUAC, and that was Elia Kazan. And Kazan was in terms of the entertainment industry, really the biggest scalp that HUAC was able to get in all of its investigations. It's impossible really to exaggerate the acclaim that Elia Kazan enjoyed in the 1950s, certainly the late 1940s as well. He had carved out a unique career as perhaps the dominant, most inspired, most gifted director, both in Hollywood and on Broadway. That is a remarkable career in his capacity to bring to life on Broadway the plays of America's two greatest playwrights of the time, Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller. And he had an extraordinary career in Hollywood as well. Perhaps his most famous film was, of course, On the Waterfront, 1954, with Marlon Brando. And Kazan had been a communist. And he had been a communist for reasons that a number of the participants have mentioned, which has to do with his belief he was an immigrant, he was an outsider, that capitalism had failed, that it was in decay in the 1930s. There was no real hope for its resurrection except through a movement that promised really the elimination of all of the sorts of frictions, all of the sorts of conflicts that had previously dogged human history. So Kazan became a communist really because he believed that communism, or at least broadly socialism, would be the path away from all of the prejudices, all of the animosities, all of the, let's call it the irrationalities that would be overcome in a much more just society than America had managed to create. So he was a communist for conventional leftist, progressive, egalitarian reasons. And because he was so famous by the early 1950s, he was a kind of natural target for HUAC. And there had been original testimony that Kazan had made in confidence, in which he indicated his willingness to talk about himself. But then it was evident that he would have to be testifying in public, and that of course meant that he would have to name names. And the controversy that swirled around his career thereafter really had to do with that. That is, Kazan was in a terrible, terrible bind because Arthur Miller, his friend, could write plays even if Arthur Miller was in jail, but Kazan could not direct plays, could not direct movies, except within an institutional setting. And therefore, Kazan, who was very reluctant, of course, initially to come before HUAC, realized that he had to cooperate more fully than he had intended to do, and therefore he named names, including people who had been friends of his. He named basically a dozen names, and in doing so, compounded what was seen to be a grievous moral error by also paying for an advertisement in the New York Times that justified the naming of names, that in fact expressed a certain pride in the naming of names, that in doing so he demonstrated, and again it's impossible to not note his own immigrant status made his own citizenship, his own Americanism in doubt, that his pride in testifying before HUAC and in naming names was something that demonstrated how fully he wished to be included within the American civic community. And it was that advertisement in the New York Times, even more than his actual testimony, that made him a figure whom all sorts of people, who were not communists even, see him as somebody who was, for all of his artistic gifts, was somebody who was morally tainted, really beyond remedy and beyond any sort of rectification.
We have a question here. Who gave Kazan instructions to capture the group theater?
The simple answer is, I don't know.
Uh-huh. So that presumably would have been like the head of his communist
cell. It could have been a head of a communist cell. He was in the movement for about half a year, a year and a half, excuse me. But who did so, I really don't know.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, shall we move on to explore Elia's career? Oh, by the way, somebody's pointed out, Laura, in fact, has pointed out that not too terribly long ago, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and that stirred protest.
Yes.
So when you said this was the most controversial Hollywood figure, he was the most controversial Hollywood figure, you're absolutely right. I mean, that protest, the controversy swirling around him came right down into the 21st century.
That's right. It was a remarkable moment, thanks, of course, to the advantage that television provides, because when Kazan was given that achievement, and I think very, very few people would deny his contribution to movies in terms of realistic acting and powerful, even progressively charged movies, as well as, of course, what he was able to do on Broadway for Miller and Williams. The camera, of course, pans out to the audience in the auditorium in Hollywood, and apparently there were three options that those in the audience faced. One was that they could stand and applaud Kazan for his artistic achievements. They could sit and applaud for his artistic achievements when he gets the Lifetime Achievement Award, or they could, in effect, sit on their hands and refuse to applaud at all. And the camera was very cruel in showing the variations among the Hollywood luminaries and how they responded to what Kazan had done. But I would like to take this opportunity to at least note in his defense that those who refused to, 50 years later, those who refused to applaud him or those who still detested him, never had to face the agonizing dilemma that HUAC imposed upon Elia Kazan.
We have another question here. Is there other evidence to support the contention that Kazan was part of a conspiracy, or was he inflating his role?
Yeah, there was never any conspiracy. The issue here for Kazan as a communist was to promote, he was starting out as an actor before he became a director, socially progressive, provocative plays, often associated with Clifford Odets, who was in some ways the key American playwright of the 1930s, with Waiting for Lefty and Awake and Sing and Golden Boy, which I think is now on Broadway, and whom he named, of course, in his own Kazan named in his own testimony. The conspiracy is not really the right word. What they wanted to do was to promote an American drama, an American theater that would address the often critical issues that faced American economy and American society, to get away from sort of the plays that seemed to be either farces or boulevardier plays that seemed disconnected with people's lives, especially the lives of the poor and the dispossessed.
Okay, well, shall we move on? Then we've got a little over half an hour.
Oh, okay. I think in this number 19 here, what was striking about this testimony is what I would take, and maybe there are participants who would disagree on this point, what I take to be a truly humiliating expression of Kazan's effort to defend himself by telling the House Committee on Un-American Activities what the meaning was, what the import was of the works with which Elia Kazan was so fully associated. And I take this to be humiliating because what he sought to do was to downplay the politically charged, often socially critical features of his of the plays and the movies that he directed, to minimize the degree to which they constituted a kind of exposure of the weaknesses of American society and American politics. So that what he's doing in describing such works is really trying to reassure HUAC that he was never anything but harmless. And I take it to be humiliating, and again, I'd be very interested in comments here. I take it to be humiliating because it's a misleading feature of what he was able to achieve. It's a way of clouding over his own extraordinary artistic achievements for the sake of ingratiating himself to congressmen who had no real idea of the power of a play like Death of a Salesman, for example.
So how did the committee respond to this? Did it convince them, or did they just disregard it?
Yeah, that's yeah. Insofar as we know, and of course we only know the testimony that has been published, and so we don't know necessarily the reactions. I think they were pleased to learn that this was the director's understanding of their own works. I doubt if too many of the congressmen had ever seen any of these plays. Maybe they had seen some of the movies. In that sense, of course, they were so glad that Elia Kazan was so cooperative that he demonstrated, in other words, Kazan's testimony legitimated HUAC in a way that perhaps no one called before HUAC had ever done before or after. So they were not going to particularly challenge him by saying, well, actually, All My Sons is a pretty devastating attack on greed over patriotism.
Yeah, I like the way he characterizes Death of a Salesman. The frustrations of the life of a salesman and implicit criticism of his materialistic standards, as if he were the only person who possessed those standards.
That's right. And I read that, Richard, I read that as another way as well, if I may add to that. By criticizing materialistic standards, I take this to be, and maybe others who are participating may see the same thing here. Materialism, of course, is what communists were accused of. Marxism was dialectical materialism. Communists were seen as materialists because Christians and other religious people were seen to be more spiritual. Materialism was something that in the 1950s was often associated with the atheism of the communists, as opposed to the religiosity and piety of Americans.
So Willie Loman, communist sympathizer.
In a way, yes.
Almost. All right. Well, let's move on then. Okay, let's take a look at our question here. I think we've addressed this. Why might he have wanted to list his plays in such a fashion? Okay, all right.
Let's move on. Okay.
We did. If I could go back just one moment to the not to this, but to a question earlier about him trying to capture the group theater. Capture probably meant recruit there, didn't it? I mean, he was asked to recruit people from the group theater.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Some of those are those who, of course, he named in when he testified in 1952.
Right. Okay. That was just a point of clarification one of our participants raised.
So that's a fair point. So now we're going to go to Alger Hiss. Is that agreeable?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Alger Hiss is an anomaly in the history of HUAC because he was largely unknown to the general public when his name gets mentioned by Whittaker Chambers, who was a senior editor of Time magazine, who had gone to the FBI in the early 1940s, actually 1939, and then again in early 1940s, to testify that Whittaker Chambers himself had been a member of the Soviet military espionage system, which was based in Washington, D.C. in the 1930s. And in his testimony to the FBI, and also to the Assistant Secretary of State, Adolf Berle, mentioned that Hiss was somebody with whom Chambers had a connection through espionage. Nothing was done. Hiss had an impressive bureaucratic career after he had graduated from Harvard Law School, after he had served as a clerk to the most luminous of all Supreme Court justices, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He had been a key figure in the Department of State, and he had risen to very high ranks within the Department of State. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, Hiss had gone to the Yalta Conference, the last of the major wartime conferences in which Franklin Roosevelt was present. Hiss was present at Yalta. That was one indication then of his role within the Department of State. After the Second World War, he becomes the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, named to that position by John Foster Dulles, who was to become Secretary of State in the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower beginning in 1953. And Hiss, in 1948, is named by Whittaker Chambers when Chambers is called to testify of being a communist. Initially, Chambers did not say that he had been involved in espionage. That only was to come out later, when Hiss denied categorically that he had had any such involved in any such activities, that he was not in any way involved in anything that was un-American, and that he even claimed that he did not know Whittaker Chambers. And that set up the dramatic face-to-face challenge between Hiss and Chambers in the HUAC hearings in 1948. Clearly, one person had perjured himself. In December of 1948, it turned out the grand jury claimed that it was Hiss who had perjured himself. And Hiss is the most important person that HUAC ever got, even though he was somewhat unusual because he was not a prominent figure. And Hiss was ultimately convicted in a second criminal trial was convicted of perjury, though it really meant that he had indeed been a spy according to the jury, because what he had perjured himself about was whether he had passed on any documents to Whittaker Chambers when Chambers was indeed a member of the Soviet military espionage network. So Hiss is the proof that Americans have something to fear from within, and not merely a nuclear weapon that the Soviets might somehow be able to deliver by bombers. Hiss, as you see from the picture, did not have a beard, was elegant, was handsome, was the product really of the finest schooling, the greatest social prestige in America. This was not somebody who was an outsider, not somebody who was a Jewish immigrant, not somebody who had done anything but enjoyed the greatest privileges that American higher education and American politics could provide him. And now, if you believed that he was indeed guilty of perjury, and he went to prison, if you believed that indeed he had been a spy, it meant, in other words, that anybody could be a legitimate object of suspicion. That is, the conviction of Alger Hiss, who, when he was at trial, was able to call upon as character witnesses two justices of the United States Supreme Court, Stanley Reed and Felix Frankfurter. He could call as a character witness Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois, who was, of course, to become the Democratic nominee for the presidency in 1952 and 1956. If Alger Hiss could be a communist, if Alger Hiss could be a spy, it meant, of course, that anybody could be a spy. And this was the most powerful piece of evidence that Americans did indeed have reason to suspect something about their neighbors, that Americans did have some reason to fear that America was being undermined from within, and by somebody whom you would not remotely expect to have been secretly serving the international communist movement based in Moscow. So let's go on here.
Some more details about Hiss.
Sorry, some more details.
Oh, that
okay.
People can. I want that. No problem. I just want to note that if our participants want to plunder the PowerPoint and use this material in their classes, there it is. We've got a little capsule summary of Hiss's career for you, should you decide to use it. But let's go on to McCarthy.
Sure. Okay. It's impossible to, in a sense, convey in the year 2013 how unusual it was for politicians to be expected to be or known to be liars. This is one of the oddities of American politics in this era, and that is, although politicians were expected to shade the truth, politicians were allowed some measure of not being thoroughly accurate in describing their policies or their careers. In the 1950s, 1940s, and earlier, politicians were cut a certain measure of slack. But what was unexpected in the career of Joseph R. McCarthy, Republican senator from Wisconsin, was the degree to which McCarthy was willing to lie with utter disregard from whether he could be caught in lies. What was unusual and remains a kind of characterological mystery about McCarthy is that he lied when it was not necessary to lie. He lied when there was a great likelihood that he would be caught. He lied for no reason whatsoever. And for approximately 4 years, from early 1950, actually briefly, only within about 2 weeks after Alger Hiss goes to prison in February of 1950, from within about 2 weeks from Hiss's imprisonment, when McCarthy first becomes famous, until the summer of 1954, when his career is largely in ruins as a result of having been caught in all sorts of shenanigans that were to bring him down. From that point, no politician in America was more dangerous, or no politician was somebody who needed more to be reckoned with, including by two American presidents, Truman and Eisenhower, than Joseph R. McCarthy. And McCarthy is along with HUAC, the most important phenomenon of the culture of the Cold War, in his capacity to sow the suspicion, to incite the fears that, for example, the conviction and imprisonment of Alger Hiss had clearly fortified. So McCarthy was unprecedented in his capacities as a demagogue to stir up the most turbulent emotions, and to do so with extraordinary impunity over the course of approximately 4 years, until he made the mistake of going up against the U.S. Army, going up against his own political party, the Republican Party, which certainly was occupying the White House at the time. And McCarthy was unusual in his willingness to be a kind of wrecker, to be a kind of buccaneer, independent of party loyalty, independent really of decency and civility, independent of any respect for his opponents. And he got away with it for those 4 years, and therefore McCarthy becomes an ism as well as a kind of token of what was so peculiar and what was in some ways so very disturbing about the anti-communism of the 1950s.
Steve, this may be a good time to pose one of the questions from the forum.
Sure.
Was McCarthyism rooted in American culture, or was it something new in the 1950s?
Great question. I can't answer it properly. On the one hand, McCarthy builds upon the anti-communism or the anti-Bolshevism that he emerged after Lenin's successful revolution in 1917 and 1918 in Russia. So broadly speaking, American political culture was anti-communist from the moment that communists take over in what becomes the Soviet Union. On the other hand, what is unusual about McCarthy, and what I really insist upon makes him different, is that he was strikingly uninterested in the Soviet Union and in the military, political, and diplomatic threat that the Soviet Union posed in the 1950s, which was a genuine threat. His only interest was in domestic communism.
Mm-hmm.
And domestic communism was a very minor phenomenon, increasingly marginalized, increasingly stigmatized, increasingly put off to the margins of American life with no capacity to effectuate any influence. And that was McCarthy's concern, and that was the mischief that, in fact, he stirred up.
We have a question here in the forum. How much do you think his wife influenced his motivations? That's a new question. I mean, I didn't realize his wife might have figured into that.
Well, I didn't know that either. He marries fairly late in his career. His wife's name was Jean McCarthy. Jean, I'm forgetting her maiden name. McCarthy marries relatively late because there were imputations, there were accusations regarding his sexual orientation. It was, of course, in that era very unusual for men in politics not to be married, not to have what was seen to be a conventional normal life. John F. Kennedy was another unmarried U.S. senator, and Kennedy marries Jacqueline Bouvier a little bit later as his presidential career takes off, without necessarily giving up his extramarital life, of course, sexually. In McCarthy's case, the reasons are not entirely clear why he did so, but there were imputations of his homosexuality that may have influenced his decision to marry Jean. But to the best of my knowledge, she had no political interest and had no influence upon him.
Okay, we have another question here that relates to one of the forum questions. TV made McCarthy, but it led to his downfall, and people saw the Army McCarthy hearings and realized that he was the bully he was. How did McCarthyism spread? Was television, what was the media environment into which it was dropped at the time? Did it really spread through TV and radio?
Yeah.
How did it spread in the country?
Yeah, television is a great case here for its virtue in the 1950s in a very odd way. In 1950, only one American home had television. By 1960, 9 American homes had television. So McCarthy's career coincides more or less with the growth of television. But McCarthy succeeds because he's able to manipulate the printed media, that is primarily newspapers, primarily daily newspapers, before television really exerts its influence. So when McCarthy denounces, when McCarthy condemns, when McCarthy accuses, these are headlines, and they draw attention to himself even though he has no backup for those accusations or those criticisms. And when television, particularly in 2 ways, first of all, See It Now, the CBS program that Edward R. Murrow co-produced with Fred Friendly, and in which Murrow was, of course, the moderator. See It Now helps to bring McCarthy down in the spring of 1954, and then the Army McCarthy hearings complete the task when they expose, as print media could not do, as headlines could not do, his bullying, his nastiness, his malice, his utter disrespect for those who were called before his committee. Mm-hmm. So television actually deserves credit for exposing him in ways that print journalism really was unable to do. And print journalism suffered from the ideal of objectivity, that is the degree to which one had to present both sides, even if one side was a demagogic liar. Mm-hmm. And television simply exposed, through the Army McCarthy hearings, exposed him as he was without having to aim at the ideal of neutrality or impartiality, and that particularly because of the way in which the Army's attorney, Joseph Welch, from the Boston law firm of Hale and Dorr, was able to exude a kind of New England integrity and decency that exposed McCarthy for the ugly monster that he was.
Mm-hmm. You've already addressed part of this question, but what types of people openly spoke out against McCarthy? Congress, newspaper, and was the press that he got, was it generally favorable, unfavorable?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, because it allows me to say that for all of the menace that McCarthy and McCarthyism posed, there were plenty of people who openly and freely opposed him, mm-hmm. with impunity, without punishment. Among them were figures of the print media, so that, for example, the editorialists for the best American newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, even some smaller newspapers, including in his own state of Wisconsin, they were vigorous in their editorials against McCarthy. Some of the most prominent figures in American journalism, like the columnist Walter Lippmann, were very, very clear in their opposition to McCarthy. The problem was that the news columns had to give him attention because he was so newsworthy. And if you only read the news columns and didn't read the editorials, which was often the case, you wouldn't see the way in which that opposition formed. Certainly, Edward R. Murrow was strongly, although somewhat belatedly, against Senator McCarthy through See It Now, 2 programs in particular. And there were all sorts of people in American public life, including in the United States Senate. Overwhelmingly, they were Democrats for obvious partisan reasons, but also there were important Republicans like Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, Arthur Watkins of Utah. These people were very strongly anti-McCarthy. And there were all sorts of people in academic life and intellectual life who were strongly anti-McCarthy, and it helped them when they were also strongly anti-communist. Because they often made the argument that McCarthy was actually discrediting the anti-communist cause.
Well, that's a question here. How do you think communism is regarded after McCarthy? Did he shift the balance toward communism? Did he, in some kind of perverse way, make communism more acceptable in this country?
Very interesting question that I haven't actually thought about. I would say McCarthy's defeat, he is censured by the United States Senate in December of 1954, and his career is basically over then. He dies 3 years later. I think what McCarthy, the discrediting of McCarthy and of McCarthyism doesn't so much open up an avenue for communism as it opens up within a few years an avenue for broader dissent. The civil rights movement would be the most obvious case. One could also mention at least the emergence of, particularly with the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, the concern about the persistence of poverty in America, a little bit later the emergence of feminism. These were all dissident movements, all of which had some communists or some ex-communists in them, but they were not in any way dominated by or particularly influenced by communists. And I think the discrediting of McCarthy gave these movements breathing space to dissent, to disagree, to openly oppose American policies that were held to be unjust without being accused of being a communist.
I have an interesting comment here. Participant grew up in Eastern Europe. The communists there used McCarthy for propaganda, which points out the wave died fast since the party discouraged any contacts with the West, particularly the United States. But McCarthy's methods were very popular in the Eastern Bloc. Well, that's not surprising. Yes. Well, shall we take a look at this quote from the McCarthy speech and see what we can do with that, Steve?
Is this the first one here?
Yes, the one that's on screen now.
Okay. Richard, would you mind reading it?
Sure. The reason why we find ourselves in a position of impotency is not because our only powerful potential enemy has sent men to invade our shores, but rather because of the traitorous actions of those who have been treated so well by this nation. It has not been the less fortunate or members of minority groups who have been selling this nation out, but rather those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has had to offer: the finest homes, the finest college education, and the finest jobs in government we can give. Well, I wonder who he's referring to.
Yes. Okay, let's assume everybody has seen the continuity with the previous the 2 slides earlier. Yes, that's, again, an indication of what was, I think, special about the message that McCarthy sought to convey. On the one hand, he presents himself as an ordinary Joe, as somebody who has his sleeves rolled up. He had been a United States Marine. He was somebody who came out of nowhere. He'd grown up initially on a farm. And he presents himself as just an American with no special benefits or privileges, but who expresses a kind of class resentment against those who have the finest college education, finest homes, finest jobs. So the degree to which this is not only an assault upon Alger Hiss, but also an assault upon the person who was seen to be a defender of Alger Hiss, namely Secretary of State Dean Acheson, a man who had been educated at Yale and at Harvard Law School, the Bishop of the state of Connecticut, somebody who would clerk for Justice Louis Brandeis. And Alger Hiss was in effect defended, as we'll see in a minute or so, was in effect defended by somebody who had all of the aura of upper class and mannerisms that McCarthy, as a Wisconsin farm boy, resented and detested and was able to play upon. The other feature of what you just read, Richard, is that McCarthy is also, in a sense, exempting what he describes as the less fortunate or members of minority groups who've been selling this nation out. McCarthy, interestingly enough, was not in any way, shape, or form a bigot. And even though it was noted earlier, Jews were disproportionately within the communist movement, there is no evidence whatsoever that McCarthy sought to exploit that. McCarthy was himself a Roman Catholic who regularly attended Mass and who drew upon the support of fellow Roman Catholics, including in the higher ranks of the church itself. But McCarthy was not a racist. McCarthy was not an anti-Semite. For McCarthy, there was only one issue, which was communism itself. and he tended to ascribe a vulnerability to communism to people who had occupied a different place in the class hierarchy of America, like Secretary of State Dean Acheson, like Alger Hiss. And that's what's so striking, it seems to me, about this particular passage that you've read. And of course, again, to simply reiterate the obvious point, he's also clearly indicating the problem is not from without, the problem is not Soviet military power, the problem is traitors and spies from within, our fellow Americans.
I have an interesting comment here from one of our participants. In an ironic way, McCarthy seems to be supporting class warfare.
Yes, actually, in a way, he is. Yes, that's right. And he was, in that sense, able to draw upon the broader resentment that existed in America against a kind of disorientation, dislocation that the New Deal had brought about, new groups coming to the fore, older groups often feeling a sense of being displaced. McCarthy was able to capitalize on that by, in a sense, saying that American communists start at the very top.
We've got about 10 minutes. Shall we move on to our next slide? That's more from the McCarthy speech.
Yes.
One thing to remember in discussing the communists in our government is that we are not dealing with spies who get 30 pieces of silver to steal the blueprints of a new weapon. We are dealing with far more sinister type of activity because it permits the enemy to guide and shape our policy. And that leads into a question from one of our participants. Is there now any evidence that there were many more traitors within the government than besides Hiss?
I would say that there were a couple of others. The one that is usually seen along these lines was an Assistant Secretary of State named Harry Dexter White. And there is some evidence that he indeed, although not probably an actual communist, was in some ways, it gets ambiguous here, perhaps guided in some level by communist policy. Although there are others, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., for example, the historian, late historian, investigating White, did not see that what White was calling for in terms of American financial policies during the war and immediately after was any different from mainstream Democratic Party orthodoxy. I would say, and it's a wonderful question, if anything, we have learned how good a job the FBI did in identifying and in following those whose subversive activities really ought to have drawn attention. The FBI had, in fact, extremely well infiltrated the Communist Party, even at the very top. And the FBI was, in fact, very, very good at checking and neutralizing any such danger. Now, McCarthy, of course, would not have wanted to know that because his whole raison d'etre was based upon the seriousness of the threat. But in fact, I think we've learned from evidence that emerged in the 1990s, excuse me, in particular, the degree to which the FBI was in fact very good at its job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So they weren't propagandists for HUAC and for McCarthy. They actually were good bureaucratic servants.
They were good bureaucratic servants in the sense that Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, was a little bit wary of giving McCarthy too long a leash. They were in fact friends, but Hoover was very wary of somebody who was clearly a loose cannon and somebody who would go into areas particularly involving espionage that would only wreck things for what the FBI was engaging in terms of surveillance on its own. It's true the FBI did give material to HUAC, often about giving the names of that were being sought through the open testimony. But even there, I think Hoover was very careful of being too closely identified with HUAC. Mm-hmm. The U.S. president that Hoover seems to have had the best relationship with was actually Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Oh.
Yeah. So I mean, Hoover, who's been properly the subject of all sorts of criticism for abuses of power in a number of ways, if one looks at the culture of the Cold War, he was actually much more concerned about legalities, following the rules, not wanting his agents to be caught doing things that were illegal, although they did so. And I think Hoover, specifically in this period, in terms of his relationship to HUAC and to McCarthy, was much more careful and much more skeptical than I think he may be given credit for.
Okay. Well, shall we move on then? We've got about 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, this part here, I would only note, since we're rapidly running out of time here, really has to do with my suggestion that to read what Dean Acheson said about Alger Hiss's conviction in relation to what Senator McCarthy then said about Dean Acheson is about as concise and abbreviated an example as I think one could find about Senator McCarthy's nastiness and his unfairness. And that is, Dean Acheson wanted to make clear that in no way does he condone what Alger Hiss was convicted of doing, and they were friends, but that as a human being, as a Christian, he did not feel that he could disobey what Jesus said in the book of Matthew, which is to say, those who turn their back on somebody who is a victim, those who turn their back on somebody who is in need, turn their back on him, capital H, that is upon Jesus. And that was the point that Dean Acheson wanted to make. He wanted to make it clear everybody will have their own way of dealing with Alger Hiss. Everybody will have their own way with dealing with somebody who was convicted of, in effect, being a spy. But that Acheson did not feel, as a human being, that he could turn his back on Hiss as a person. And McCarthy, of course, is seeing that in the most unfair and misleading way, as a way of emphasizing that Dean Acheson was in fact soft on communists, that the Department of State under Dean Acheson was in fact doing something that would endanger American security. And Acheson was in fact doing nothing of the sort.
We have a participant has written an extensive note here, but at the end he comes to the big question. Do you think Hiss was really guilty, or today is that still unknown?
Yeah. Hiss continues to have his defenders, but the overwhelming evidence is that he was guilty. And the second trial demonstrated through incontrovertible typewriter evidence that Whittaker Chambers could not have gotten by any other means, that Hiss was in fact guilty of espionage. The only real issue involving Alger Hiss these days, I believe, among historians and scholars of this topic, is whether it made any difference to the Soviet Union what Hiss may have passed on from the Department of State. About that, it seems to me there are legitimate and proper disagreements. But I think the case is pretty closed on Alger Hiss, that he was in fact guilty, although he went to his death denying it.
Right, and in the note here, our participant writes, Hiss was readmitted to the Massachusetts bar in '75, maintains his innocence. The pumpkin papers did not contain anything damning when they were really examined in '75. The typewriter, considered one of the main pieces of evidence against Hiss, later to prove to be forgeable, and so on. So I don't want to reopen the case here.
No, but that's simply not true, that it was not a forgery.
Okay. All right.
We'll argue that with.
We'll do another seminar on that.
That's great. Okay.
Okay. Shall we move on? I think we've got one more slide here, and then we can move ahead to wrap things. There is a discussion question, and that just refers back to the question.
So one more slide.
That's it, actually. But let me do this, Steve.
Sure.
Before we can wrap things up here, I just want to ask one question that kind of opens into the next decade. And quickly, did the nature of the Cold War change in the 1960s? That's one of our forum questions. Why don't we end on that, looking ahead?
Okay, and I'll be very brief on that point. Yes, it does. That is, but basically happens by the early 1960s. is that the fever breaks. It becomes possible to challenge the status quo without being accused of being a communist, without there being extraordinary pressure to do so. And for me, the most striking moment is when somebody who had been to the Soviet Union, had been associated with communism, namely Lee Harvey Oswald, assassinates a president of the United States. And the popular reaction against whatever was left of communism was very, very muted. So domestically, anti-communism loses its force, its capacity to intimidate and terrorize. The Cold War, of course, continues until the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically in 1991. But that's the end of it.
Mm-hmm. Would it be fair to say that in the 60s, the perception of the enemy moved from the enemy within to the enemy without? I mean, we ended the big Cold War battle, of course, was Vietnam, and we weren't fighting ourselves. We were fighting proxy communists, or real communists in North Vietnam.
That's right. So you've got Cuba, of course, in 1961-62, the Berlin crises, which occur around the same time, and, of course, the Vietnam War, which basically, in its frustration and its failure, ends the whole foreign policy that is dominated merely by anti-communism. And then with détente that comes at the end of the Vietnam War, even the Cold War itself internationally becomes muted.
Okay. Well, I hope we've answered all of your questions, ladies and gentlemen. I want to remind you to use the forum to continue the discussion. We'll be monitoring it until March 12th and passing your questions and comments on to Steve. Steve, I want to thank you very much for giving us an excellent seminar. This has really been informative. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our participants did. And I want to thank our participants as well for their intelligent and active participation. And I want to remind everybody that our next FLVS seminar is going to be on March 13th, 2013, on a topic not unrelated to our seminar today, the roots of the counterculture. So please be sure to join us then. Again, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and have a good day.